Hey everybody, Clint, Locked On Bulldogs. Today's episode, we are interviewing Alan Judd of the AJC about the allegations of Georgia football players and the cultural problems that are perceived by some in the media. I do want to tell you, however, that the Locked On Bulldogs, while we are talking about mature things like abuse and domestic violence and violence against women, that we will always stand with victims and those who have been and are abused. If you find yourself in that situation, I want to encourage you. If you or somebody you know find yourself in an abuse situation, if somebody's taking advantage of you, please call 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-HOPE. We stand with victims and we want due process to find justice for those who have been mistreated and abused by others in the world. Please enjoy the interview we have with Alan Judd. Locked On Bulldogs stands firmly with those who are victims, and we want to help bring more understanding and more light to a complex issue, but do it fairly and justly all at the same time. Next on Locked On Bulldogs. Welcome, everybody. This is Locked On Podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, and we are excited to welcome Alan Judd onto the podcast, Locked On Bulldogs, today. We're going to ask him the cultural issues happening at UGA, the allegations, and a little bit about his article that he wrote this last month. Stay tuned next on Locked On Bulldogs.
You are Locked On Bulldogs, your daily podcast on the Georgia Bulldogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, FanDuel.com. Make every moment more about them in a moment. But I do want to welcome onto the podcast a very special guest, Alan Judd of the AJC. Alan, how are you doing today, sir?
Doing great, thanks.
Good. Glad to have you with us. If you're a Bulldog fan, you may have been following along. The AJC has written a couple of articles recently. Most recently, Alan, I'm sure you've had other articles before or after this, but on June 22nd or 27th, you published an article, UGA football program rallies around when players accused of abusing women. We're going to talk about that a little bit today, ask some questions, get some behind the scenes. Some more things have come out since then. And so just want to first start kind of set the stage for folk. Alan, what do you do at the AJC? What's your kind of purview, your niche? What do you do reporting over there for the AJC?
I'm an investigative reporter on our investigative team. I don't normally cover sports. This has been something that's come up in the last few months because of some of the issues going on at UGA. Obviously, UGA and especially the football team they're both really huge institutions in the state of Georgia, and for that reason, it's kind of fallen to me and some of my colleagues in our group to look a little deeper into some of the issues that our normal beat writers covering Georgia football and other Georgia athletics don't have the time to do. They still have to cover the games and the off season and the recruiting and all the other stuff that they normally do.
Yep, that's great. So investigating reporting for the AJC. And I think when that report came out, let's set that parameter out, specifically the one, and like I said, I'm sure there's been others that have been written since, but the one that's titled UGA football program rallies around when players accused of abusing women. And just wanted to get a clarification. Writing this piece and doing this investigation, what's the hope from the AJC and you specifically, Alan? What do you want to see happen? What's the hope from writing this article?
I mean, we don't really have an agenda for that, in that sense. But I mean, it's really trying to just get the truth out about what's happening with that program. Obviously, they have hit a level of success that's never been seen at UGA before, and never seen really, much of any school before. But along with that, there are questions that come up about, what's happening off the field, and that's really been a question that's come up a lot since January, since the car crash that killed Devin Bullock and Chandler LaCroix. So that seemed to open a window onto some off-field behavior by some players that is kind of questionable. And then you have the question, well, what's the team, what's the coaches, what's the university doing in response to that?
Yeah. And so that's the Great question. And yeah, that Devin Willock and what happened with that car accident with Chandler, unfortunate circumstance. Wish we had more time. You may have written and helped with that, but there are other articles out there on that. So we'll keep that one off to the side. We'll focus on this one and the, the allegation of the treatment of women. And there were three things, as I read through the article, I think there's three things we wanted to break down. One of the examples you gave was Adam Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
So Adam Anderson was on the team. Allegations came about. And he was promptly not allowed to play football at UGA once those allegations came out. So let's start there with Adam. What about Adam's specific story includes in this headline of rallying around him? What was it that your investigation led and said, hey, we need to kind of expose maybe some of these cultural issues with Adam Anderson specifically in his case?
Well, as soon as the police began investigating this, were very shortly after they began investigating it, they notified a gentleman named Brian Gant, whose title is Director of Player Support, I believe, for the team, who gets involved when players have law enforcement issues or court dates or other things of that nature. And he participated in gathering witnesses to help the police. One of those witnesses apparently stopped talking once they all sat down together, because Gant's in the room when he's being interviewed by the detective, and which may influence his what he says about a teammate. And then Gant also went to court as a character witness for Anderson, when he was up trying to get out on bond. A number of players, I think it was 8 players, were allowed to come to practice late. Apparently an agreement between Anderson's defense lawyer and Coach Smart, allowing them to go to court, stand up, identify themselves and their affiliation with the team, trying to help him get bond. All of this while the alleged victim in this case was an employee of the football program. Was a student part-time employee who knew all these players, who knew Coach Gant, knew Coach Smart, knows everybody, and they chose to support their teammate over this person who was alleging that he raped her.
Yeah. And I guess that's a bunch of our listeners, a bunch of UGA, want to just ask the question, what's the worst case scenario about due process with Adam Anderson? Every single person that goes in for bail has a hearing that is character witness. You can call anybody in the world to come to the character witness for that. And maybe he asked them, maybe he didn't, maybe it was getting. But what's the downfall to people rallying around those who have not been convicted of a crime, been accused of a crime, being a character witness? What's the downside to that?
In terms of the individuals, I don't know that there is, but in terms of the institution has a responsibility to both parties. They're both students at UGA. They are actually, federal law prevents a university from taking a stand for an accused student over the accuser in a situation like that. You can argue that this was all done on an individual basis, that there was no coordination, but in fact, Anderson's lawyer is a very reputable criminal defense lawyer from Atlanta, stood up in court and said, pursuant to my promise to Coach Smart, I'm going to get them back to practice on time. And he had worked it out through the university's general counsel, plus Gant's involvement. So there did appear to be an institutional position being taken there that favored the accused over the woman who said she was raped by Anderson.
Yeah, and that's maybe the big question is favored or not. Maybe she did ask for character witnesses on her behalf, and maybe they declined. And I was playing college football, and I got asked to do a wedding, and I went to my head coach and I said, "Hey, I need to do this wedding? I need to be best man." He excused that. That wasn't him partaking in the wedding itself. He had no clue who those people were. That was an agreement there. And so maybe I suppose that cultural issue of fellow teammates, fellow friends standing up for one another, and not maybe going, if she asked, that could have been great. And until there is conviction, until something plays out, until the day in court is there, it does seem that there is impropriety because there wasn't a push from Kirby Smart or anybody in the institution to say, hey, what do you guys want to do? It's been well noted the football players have that freedom to do what they do. And so I think one of the things that from the Adam Anderson thing is he was not allowed to play anymore on the team.
Right.
That's not being favoritism to him. That's actually being very, very before a conviction comes out, before a day in court happens. And so some might argue that favoritism was in her favor to say he can no longer play football here with the team, regardless of what happens in the court. That's no longer.
Yeah, I think that's a hard one because the players knew who she was, and and she got harassed a great deal on campus. She had to quit her job because she didn't feel safe there any longer. She was essentially outed to the larger university community. And, I think it's hard to say that she received any kind of favorable treatment during this time at all.
Yeah, no, I think the treatment of whatever happened on that, again, from her decision to do what she was going to do, I'm talking specifically of the cultural issues within the football program and Kirby Smart saying Adam Anderson was without a conviction, just an allegation removed from the football team. Mm-hmm. That's not playing favorites to him, is I suppose what I'm trying to say. Regardless of outside of that, one of the accusations is to say, hey, he received favoritism from the coaching and from the program, and say, well, he was removed from the football team, maybe not been favored. And again, with her, that's something that we don't know a great deal about. Try to respect that woman and what she does. We have no insight to that. Right. We're going to come back after this, ask Alan Judd a few more questions about the article that we're talking about. But first, these messages. And these messages are brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is the official sports book of Locked On Podcasts and Locked On Bulldogs. FanDuel.com/Locked On. You can get over there right now, FanDuel.com/Locked On. And if you're a first-time user, first-time guest, deposit your money. If you make a bet and your first bet does not cash, you can go ahead and get $1,000 into bonus bets right back at you. Make every moment more with FanDuel.com. Right now, you can get on baseball. You can get on futures for football, all the SEC, the championship, all of these things that are coming to fall. Hey, you might even get it on some little early action MVP voting. Again, as those odds are still out there, it's not early action. It's before the All-Star break. But go ahead and get Ronald Acuna. It's fantastic over there. FanDuel.com/Locked On. Make every moment more with FanDuel.com/Locked On. We are back with Alan Judd, AJC, and talking about the article entitled UGA Football Program Rallies When Players Accused of Abusing Women. We talked about the Adam Anderson thing. Let's go to the other gentleman that was named, and that is Jarrett. He was commented on as the investigation goes that on a recruiting trip, he met up with a woman, had relationships with this woman, as well as underage drinking. Since your article has come out, Alan, there's been a number of text messages that have been made public, as well as some police investigation notes made public from that time, in which the woman herself has said she did not accuse him of any wrongdoing. Rather, there was an element of what happened, their interaction, the use of a video film that was not her liking. Other than that, there was none. So, Alan, I just want to quickly, your story came out before those came out. Is there anything that you would want to change about your story?
No, the stuff you're saying that came out was always part of the record. We saw everything involved in this police investigation, not just the summary that a detective wrote. We obtained from the police the full video interviews they did with Jamal Jarrett and with the victim, several hours of video, which was not included in the report that you're talking about. The detective in that case wrote a final report that seemed to be very incomplete. He did not include her rather detailed descriptions of the force that he used against her, that she says she used. He didn't include the many ways that she said no and tried to stop him. Instead, he gave a very different report claiming that's what she said. But when you see the video of what she said to the detective, it's a different story. So that summary from him is pretty questionable, and to say that that's somehow the final word is just inaccurate.
Yeah, then maybe the question is, why didn't you include those things in your story?
they just weren't relevant. And what she said to him, she was after the fact, she was trying to be nice to him, trying not to irritate him because she didn't want him to publish the videos. Rape victims frequently say, stay in contact with their accusers. It's not that uncommon. You look at high profile cases from, Bill Cosby to Harvey Weinstein, you'll see that, because women are afraid of what the men will do if they antagonize them. I interviewed a number of experts about this, and it was not at all surprising. She did say no. She did say there was a crime. She said that he forced her to perform oral sex against her will. She also said she did some of it consensually, and then it got out of hand, basically. It was a nuanced situation. The police report took out all the nuance and just, they clearly weren't going to charge the kid from the start. The detective we saw on the video when he interviewed him said, "I'm here looking out for you." He talked about my beloved Bulldogs. So there seemed to be an assumption from the start that he didn't believe it, or he didn't want to believe it.
Yeah, and maybe the two questions
before he ever talked to the victim.
Yeah, no, I hear that. And I guess the nuanced approach you're saying, I guess one of the things, as I read your article, Alan, one of the things that came across is that there was no nuance in what you were writing. And I agree, it is nuanced. It is complex. And that's, I think, what's kind of frustrating for some of us as we read things is the black and whiteness, this, rallies around when players are accused of abusing women. Yeah, there is a sense of community, and there is a sense of ambiguity with a lot of this. And I don't pretend to be an expert on any of this whatsoever, but I do know that finding out due process and going through proper channels and advocating for victims is good. But I also know there is a lot of nuance. And I guess my statement is, when I read your article, there was none of that nuance that I got later. Now, I'm not willing to say anything definitively, but I am willing to say, man, I need to take a step back. And you said earlier the hope was to bring truth to this. And I suppose, to me, when you say it wasn't relevant, those pieces that you didn't include weren't relevant, I would argue those are insanely relevant to make a nuanced conclusion based upon a very complex issue. And the not including them, to me, seems to be hiding another side of the fact, instead of just presenting all the things and then being able to trust readers and trust people to come to conclusions. I guess that's what's a little frustrating for me as I hear you talk. When we want truth to come out, I agree. But the exclusion of the text message from her, the exclusion of later police reports, and even to your point, when he says, "My beloved Bulldogs, I'm looking out for you," I have a bunch of police buddies, and one of their things they do is to try to make rapport with an accuser, to make them feel maybe the accuser can tell me things because he thinks I'm on his side. And that's a police tactic that is used constantly. And that could be another angle. And so I suppose in all of this, I do want all the facts. I do want all the information. I want to be able to understand it completely. And it feels like since you had the information and you didn't report on that information, it seems lacking to me, at least on that regard.
There was a lot in there. We saw 1,000 pages of his text messages. I could not possibly publish all that in one story, obviously. Some of them were with her. He was also, at the same time he was out the same night, he was trying to hook up with 2 other women who basically told him no. He was out till 3 a.m. with players at a bar downtown, drinking by his own acknowledgement. Prior to the weekend that they met, we talked about in the story, she had seen him at the 20, the championship celebration for the 2021 season in January 2022, and basically had kind of found him on social media and struck up a friendship. And he was sending her messages saying there was going to, basically he wanted oral sex when they got together, and she kind of laughed about it, and didn't probably say no to that up front, maybe as much as she could have. She didn't shut it down to start, and then when they got together, she did have sex with him immediately, which the story says. And then it got out of hand when he came back after being out with the players in some of the bars downtown or at least one of the bars downtown. You know, the elements of what happened afterward, she did want to press charges, despite what the detective said. I mean, she said it very clearly. She said something to the effect of, "I don't want to ruin his life, but I also don't want this to happen to somebody else." You know, I mean, she saw him as a threat to other women. Whether that's, you know, a valid way to look at it or not, that's, you know, we'll see over time. You know, I will say Jarrett went on to kind of get into his own little controversy during the NFL draft when he was live streaming himself watching the draft and made some racist anti-Asian comments that he had to apologize for. So, you know, there seems to be a lack of maturity there to the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. There does seem to be, again, like I'm saying, more to the story. And I think, Alan, one of the things as I was reading your story, I commented on this woman getting a hotel room, having a relationship with him beforehand, having this communication. There was a rapport beforehand. And her statement of, "I don't want this to happen to any other woman," again, without her saying, "I do want to press charges." And we know Athens PD will press charges on anybody for any time. We have a litany list of UGA players that have been brought up on charges for anything, anytime. And that side of the story is heavy laden, that has been proven time and time again.
Now, I would argue with you that actually there are plenty of cases where they don't file charges. We've seen tons of those, especially in domestic violence cases.
Yeah, and that's filing charges or not. My point being, if a woman says, "I don't want this to happen to anybody else," without her definitive statement, "I don't want somebody raped like I was," without that statement being full. And again, I'm not.
Well, in the context, you have to also see the context. She is talking to a detective about her sexual assault. What she says was a sexual assault. "I don't want that to happen to anybody else." I think that's a pretty clear statement that what she's talking about.
Yeah, and Alan, I guess the pushback would be that's clear for somebody writing a report, but not clear for courts and not clear for police. So you can say it's pretty clear. And what I'm trying to say, what I'm pushing back against is I have to reserve judgment until the due process is done in entirety. And taking this woman seriously, her credibility seriously, is of the utmost importance. I suppose that to say, if she wants charges pressed, she will get charges pressed. That is an unfathomable.
That's just not true. She wanted to have him charged, and the detective said no. The detective did not consult with the district attorney's office, which is the typical way of doing it. He closed the case on his own.
Can this case be reopened at any time?
No.
This case can't be reopened at any time.
I mean, you can't have double jeopardy on the same case.
Well, double jeopardy is when you're brought up on charges. He was never brought up on charges.
Yeah. No, I don't believe it. I don't believe it will be reopened.
But I just want to, I want to press. It can be.
Okay.
But and again,
I don't know. I'm not a legal expert on.
Well, that's what I suppose, Alan. That's my point in this conversation is to say it's not double jeopardy. He hasn't been charged with anything, so it can be reopened at any time. So if from any report, or if she would like to, she can walk right back in and clarify her statement. That happens all the time in police reports, as you know.
I will tell you that if you watch the video, there was no lack of clarity. The detective's report that he wrote after that interview was where if there's any lack of clarity, it's in his summary of it, not from what she said. I mean, we have it. I can't show it to you because we've agreed not to make her identity public, because that's typically the way we handle women who say they've been sexually assaulted. We as a society, we don't usually identify them without their consent. Not just us, but anybody in general, any media. But if you saw it, you would have a very different view of the case from what that detective wrote in that kind of brief report that he did after the fact.
Yeah. Did she ask you specifically not to release her identity?
Yes, we talked about it. She considered it, and I will tell you the reason that she finally said no, since she didn't want to do it, was she knew she would be harassed by Bulldogs fans. And having been harassed myself for the last several days in a way that it would be nothing compared to what she would have received, I understand that, and I respect that.
Certainly, I'm glad that you asked her. I'm glad that she felt comfortable with that to say, please don't do so. And so that piece of it again.
And I will tell you, but someone outed her online regardless, and she had to take down all of her social media and has sort of gone and laid low for several days now because of the harassment she was receiving.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to this point, we have not uttered her name. We won't utter her name. That's not something we want to do. We want to, again, I want to make clear, we respect the assault victims in entirety. There's been a number of instances in which we have had stories like that and seen people dismissed from the team quietly and then charges brought up other times. We won't do that on this podcast, and we want to protect her as well. So I'm glad you guys enjoy that same thing. Thank you for doing that, Alan. We're going to come back right after this. But first, a few messages. I'm back with Alan Judd of the AJC, talking about his article that he wrote, talking about the 11 or 12 individuals that have been accused, Adam Anderson, Jamal Jarrett, and addressing those abuse allegations from other people. So, Alan, the other question I had is, reading your article, there were 11 other players commented about having these accusations and brought about. Why not share their names and what information you had on those other players?
Some of that was just merely, it gets into, there's a lot of detail. We don't have the space in a story, in a newspaper story, to go into every single one of those. But there were other cases. The ones we wrote about were probably the most egregious cases, the most serious cases. There was another one of a player who was accused of, he was charged. The charge was ultimately dropped for lack of prosecution by the DA. But he videotaped himself having sex with a woman who had passed out from drinking. They didn't charge him with sexual assault, even though the video shows that she had no idea what was happening. But he was charged. He stayed on the team for another year. Then he went into the transfer portal and left, and ended up he ended up at a couple other schools before he kind of petered out. But there were the others mostly were domestic violence cases. Some of those, again, we just, you don't want to get into the victims because they have situations. Some of those were charged. Some of them, the women, chose not to press charges because they were in a relationship with the player. There was one player in particular, I think he had 2 different times the same young woman called the police when they were having situations, and one of those resulted in charges, one did not, but there was police reports were written about it. There was another one where a player, I think, was sort of stalking a woman he had some relationship with and was waiting outside her apartment with a gun. So, and again, some of those end up in charges, some of them don't. I think that's probably not uncommon for domestic violence cases. That's, kind of the way that works. So we could have named them all because it's all public records, but we just didn't. And you can only go so deep in one story. We may come back and name them all later. I don't know if it's necessary or not, but.
Yeah, and I guess the question, as you're describing all of this and the research and the understanding and the investigation into it, couldn't you say, and a case could be made as I'm hearing you talk about this, if there are these other instances and if the detectives and if all of this is there, doesn't this seem like an institutional cultural problem for the district attorney and police department rather than UGA football?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, it is. You have to wonder in some of those cases why. For instance, the case of the player who videotaped himself having sex with a woman blacked out drunk. The DA did nothing for 2.5 years, and then as that district attorney was leaving office, dismissed that along with I don't know how many other cases, but a large number of other cases that they just had not prosecuted. Part of that was COVID. It was a period of time where there was a huge backlog in the criminal justice system. Which probably still exists, but it was really bad, through 2020, 2021. And, a lot of those kinds of cases just kind of got waylaid somewhere. But yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we're looking at. There are real questions about why these things aren't done. I will tell you, in the Adam Anderson case, he's been arrested 2 other times, apart from the 2 rape cases. Since the 2 rape cases, been arrested 2 other times for in a domestic violence situation with a former girlfriend. One of those, he tried to break into her apartment during the middle of the night when she was there with her new boyfriend, broke the window out, ended up hurting himself. And then the other one, he was arrested. Apparently, he assaulted her at a party that he found her at, like 4 days after the first arrest. So, but yet his bond hasn't been revoked. He's still out on bond. So, there are plenty of questions to go around, to say the least.
Yeah, and I guess, Alan, that's one of the things that's kind of infuriating with a lot of this process. There's blame all around, and there's completely, again, this podcast stance is, again, we listen to victims, we trust victims, we want due process for them, we want actual justice, and actual justice means a conviction and no tampering on things and not having things get spilled out. Because if it does happen, and it does seem, as we talk to more people on the ground, as we understand the football culture and the program, the number of players that have been dismissed from this team, although not through a public accord, but through other channels to say you're not welcome here in this program because of that, should give credibility to the players that are on this team. And a few bad apples continue to crop up, and you need to deal with them appropriately so. And this appropriation is following due process with it, so that these women do feel safe around UGA athletics and players and the coaching staff and all the like. And there is certainly blame to go around. And the cultural issues seem to be, as you talk to more and more players and more people on the ground, the positive side seem to far outweigh the negative side. And the investigation that you guys have keep going to try to figure out what is this stopping point that is, how do these things come? And so that's kind of when I leave the final question as we look through all of these 11, 12 allegations and whatnot is what should be, Alan, what should be done? Because unless I'm completely mistaken, you and I have the same amount of sexual convictions on our record as Jamal Jarrett does. And so we should be given the same due process ourselves as he is. And so I guess the question is, what should be done about this? Have you asked what is being done from Kirby Smart and UGA, or what should be done?
We've asked many times, but let me back up a little bit though on the due process question. Due process is in the legal system. He has no due process with the football team. He is on that team at the pleasure of Kirby Smart.
Absolutely.
And if Smart decides, if Coach Smart says, I don't want that kid around, he's not going to be around.
Absolutely. Just like with Adam Anderson and a number of other people, they were dismissed unceremoniously.
Mark Richt just cut people, with for almost anything. It seemed like there for a couple of years. And some coaches do, some don't. But so it doesn't require a conviction to decide. And in that particular case, not only there's the sexual assault allegation, there's the underage drinking with players, there's staying out, breaking curfew, sneaking out, the whole thing. It's like if you're on a job interview and that happened on your weekend of your job interview, you probably wouldn't get hired. Any place I've ever worked, you would not have gotten hired. But sure. But I think the biggest thing right now is Coach Smart has been really pretty much silent about all this. Now, he's spoken publicly, I believe just the one time, maybe twice since January from when the car crash happened. He did say, in response to a question about punishing players, he said, well, everybody wants to know the punishment. Well, the players know what it is. But then you keep having players getting pulled over, going close to 100 miles an hour. There was another one apparently a few days ago where we just heard about in the last day or so. Despite what happened in January, they're still doing it. So you have to, then you think, well, is that punishment severe enough? Maybe he needs to crack down a little more. He doesn't, because they can hurt themselves, which is going to hurt the program, or they can hurt other people, which is really horrible too.
Yes.
But I think the transparency would go a long way to know exactly what he does when these allegations come up and when these problems come up, and how he deals internally with players. I think would give people who care about the university and who care about the football program a lot of comfort to know something actually is being done.
Yeah, absolutely. And those of us who love the program and are close to it, it is frustrating. Kirby Smart is not very public. He's a very, 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 very private man, and a lot of things are handled in-house. That is frustrating for a lot of people outside. And I suppose, again, there's a piece of it to us that seems to be we do know those who have been dismissed and trying to protect those who maybe are in minor infractions. We know a number of players who left the team that could have themselves been brought up on charges. A young gentleman went out to the West Coast that probably himself, there was no sexual allegations, but there were definite problems with teammates. And Kirby Smart not wanting to have his character injured on the way out, even though something could have brought up. Now, that's not sexual allegations, and that is a different tier. Again, hear me on this podcast saying that is very, very, very serious. We should treat it with the utmost respect. But it is frustrating, and Kirby is a silent, private person, and I think deliberately so. And so that transparency issue, as well as many other organizations, I'd love to know how Google charges me for half the things they charge me. And I still to this day have no clue how they charge me, or Apple charges me for things. I wish they would tell me. He's Alan Judd of the AJC. His Twitter is right there, Alan Judd 3000. Go over, give him a follow. Alan, I know you got a deadline to get to. You've given us more than the time that I allotted you. Sure. So I appreciate you, sir, for doing that. This has been Locked On Bulldogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. We will see you all later.